Good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for being here this evening. My name is Laura Murphy. I teach history in the Department of History, Government, and Economics, and I currently hold the Handel Foundation Endowed Faculty Chair to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. I'm very pleased to introduce to you this year's Handel speaker, Professor Landon Storrs, who will deliver a lecture titled Hidden Convictions, the Second Red Scare, and the Unmaking of the New Deal Left. Before I do so, however, I want to thank the people who made this event possible. First and foremost, thank you to Bern and Shirley Handel of the Handel Foundation. Please join me in expressing our appreciation for their generous support of the Handel Lecture Series. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Pamela Eddington, President of Dutchess Community College, to her first Handel Lecture. Thank you so much for being here and for your support of this event as well as so many others. Thank you as well to Diana Pollard. Thank you also to the co-sponsors, the DCC Honors Program and Honors Program Chair Werner Steger, as well as the DCC Foundation, and also to Diana Pollard, Michelle Romano, Perry Catino, Peggy Knoll, Judy Stokes, Doug Leik, Jeff Baker, Jody Hess, and all the other people making this event possible this evening. Thank you as well, and to the members of the History, Government, Economics Department for supporting this event and for being such wonderful all-around colleagues. I'm also, of course, very grateful to Professor Landon Storrs, who made the journey all the way from the University of Iowa, where she is Associate Professor of History, to be with us this evening. I've been an admirer of Professor Storrs' work since I was in graduate school, and her first book, Civilizing Capitalism, The National Consumers League, Women's Activism, and Labor Standards in the New Deal Era, was published in the year 2000. My dissertation advisors, Catherine Sklar and Tom Dublin, were corresponding with Dr. Storrs about her research and giving her work their highest praise. Civilizing Capitalism provides a compelling analysis of women reformers' efforts during the Great Depression to establish strong labor standards to raise wages and shorten working hours for American workers. This book and her most recent one, which I'll mention in a moment, will be available for, the earlier book actually isn't available. I apologize. Her most recent book will be available after the lecture for purchase, and Dr. Storrs has generously agreed to sign copies after the lecture is over. Dr. Storrs has also published numerous articles in anthologies and journals, including the Journal of American History, Feminist Studies, the Journal of Women's History, and the Journal of Policy History, as well as last year in The Nation, a fascinating piece about New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's parents' persecution under the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. She has served as an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow and was awarded the James Madison Article Prize by the Society for History in the federal government. At the University of Iowa, Professor Storrs teaches an array of undergraduate and graduate courses in the history of women, politics, and social movements. Her most recent book, which will be available for sale and signing after the lecture, is The Second Red Scare and the Unmaking of the New Deal Left, which is the subject of this evening's talk. Please help me welcome Dr. Landon Storrs to Dutchess Community College.
Good evening, and thank you, Laura Murphy, for that wonderful, warm introduction. I'm blushing from all that praise. Thank you. So I must first echo Laura's thanks to the Handel family and Foundation for sponsoring this annual lecture on the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, who you see here. Now I'd like to start off, I usually like to get to know my audience a little bit. Could you put your hand up, please, if you voted for Franklin Roosevelt? Thank you for laughing. Thank you. You would have to have been born, I think, before 1923. Is that right? 23 plus 21 to have voted for him the last time he was elected. Well, my grandparents, all of them voted against him for varying reasons. Some were Connecticut Yankees, some were Virginia Democrats. My parents were born during the war, the World War II, while Franklin Roosevelt was in office. So they were too young to have voted for him. I was born in 1962 when Franklin Roosevelt was long gone. Eleanor Roosevelt was then heading the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which helped revitalize the American feminist movement. Of course, when I was born, I wasn't aware yet that she was doing this. In fact, I didn't learn it until I was in graduate school writing a dissertation about women's activism on behalf of minimum wage and maximum hours laws, which was a cause that Eleanor Roosevelt supported. And she worked with the New York Consumers League and Women's Trade Union League. So in revising that dissertation into a book, I made the first of several research trips to the FDR Library and Archives just up the road. And I'm curious, this is pretty nearby. Have many of you been there? Lots. Okay, lots. All right, so you might not have voted for the Roosevelts, but you have been to their visitor center, wonderfully redone visitor center. I then returned to those same archives several more times in working on my second book. There's the first one. And this is the project I want to talk about tonight. So one way to describe this book is to call it a history of the Federal Employee Loyalty Program. If you're ever trying to sell a book to a publisher, I don't recommend that you describe it like that. That will put people to sleep. But that is at the heart of what the book is about. This Federal Employee Loyalty Program began in the early 1940s in response to right-wing allegations that the Roosevelt administration was harboring communists. The loyalty program, somewhat oddly, I think, had never been studied before until I did this book. And then I realized it wasn't so odd because the problem was that the government records were all closed. And so not until a certain amount of time had passed and some of the people who had been loyalty defendants were deceased was I able to do Freedom of Information Act requests and get their files. So over the course of about a decade, I managed to get access to some fascinating records that allowed me to intervene in several debates. So this will be a very quick overview, I promise. One of the first things that I found in studying this loyalty program was with regard to the vision and influence of the Democratic left on the New Deal. The New Deal, of course, was Roosevelt's program to end the Great Depression and to reduce the impact of any future such calamities. And so I found in the course of my work that the New Deal actually provided opportunities in government service to a hitherto little noticed group of left-leaning men and women whose vision included not only class justice, but also they linked that to gender and racial justice. Now, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt themselves, I would not call leftists. I would call them liberals. They did not advocate a transition from capitalism to socialism, for example. But in the 1930s, it's important to remember, this was before the rise of Stalin, this was before the Cold War. The line between liberals and leftists was not sharply drawn. And the Roosevelts were open-minded and willing to work with talented people of diverse political views towards shared objectives, such as raising the purchasing power, sort of a Keynesian demand-side economics idea, raising the purchasing power of ordinary Americans so they could afford to buy stuff to get the economy going again. Eleanor especially was committed to increasing the political participation of women and African Americans, as well as working people of all races and genders. So that's the first point. Secondly, I was startled to realize just how much the growing influence of this small but energetic, highly educated group of leftists within New Deal agencies, I was surprised to realize how much this group angered conservatives in and out of government. They antagonized Southern Democrats like Martin Dies, Howard Smith of Virginia, as well as enraging conservative Republicans like John Tabor of New York, Homer Ferguson of Michigan. So conservative congressmen and their staff, so I'm saying this is bipartisan conservatism, began accusing the Roosevelt administration of harboring communists long before Soviet espionage became a concern. They targeted agencies that threatened certain business prerogatives. The National Labor Relations Board, in particular, employers in labor-intensive enterprises particularly resented the National Labor Relations Board for the upward pressure on wages that it created. The Wartime Office of Price Administration was another nemesis of the right. It established price controls that, in an attempt to limit inflation, that of course limited profits. But there were lots of agencies that attracted the attention of anti-communist conservatives, the WPA, the TVA, the SEC, and so on. Well before the federal loyalty program was formalized by President Truman in 1947, the Civil Service Commission yielded to political pressure and, with the FBI's assistance, gathered much of the information that later would be used against left-leaning employees, very few of whom were members of the Communist Party, and even many fewer of those engaged in espionage. So what I'm suggesting is that the second Red Scare in government began earlier than is generally recognized and was reaction more against social democratic policies than against espionage. I emphasize that point because others have interpreted new or relatively new findings about espionage that came out in the 1990s. Others have interpreted the new espionage information to mean that Senator Joseph McCarthy and his ilk were basically right, basically correct about the Red Menace. The Texas Board of Education, for example, has revised its curriculum standards to that effect, to require high school teachers to say that McCarthy was basically vindicated. So that's another thing that this book does, is it weighs in on the bitterly debated origins and effects of the second Red Scare. Also, a third point, just as I was surprised at the extent to which feminism was part of the vision of many New Dealers, so did I find that anti-feminism was an integral aspect of the reaction against the New Deal. The federal government, it turns out, employed more professional women than any other employers. It was a lot easier if you were a woman graduating from law school. You couldn't get a job as a Wall Street lawyer. You couldn't get a job in a law school, but the government would hire you because the merit exams were gender blind. So that gave conservatives yet another reason to dislike the federal bureaucracy. And I would say that the specter of the nanny state, the feminizing and feminized welfare state, is not new, actually. That specter was rearing its head in the 1930s in some quarters. During the Red Scare, I found that a disproportionate percentage of high-ranking loyalty defendants were women. Maybe 20% of high-ranking civil servants charged with loyalty violations were women. Women held only about 3% of high-ranking government jobs. And on this point about anti-feminism, I'll just add with regard to Eleanor Roosevelt, she was technically never a loyalty defendant. The First Lady's not a civil servant, but she was constantly attacked, as I'm sure many of you know, by conservatives for many reasons, but they believed she was a pink. But I wanted to mention in particular that in 1950, she participated in a celebration of International Women's Day, which has been celebrated for more than a century on March 8th. And because that holiday originated as a socialist, feminist holiday with Clara Zetkin, the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt celebrated International Women's Day was cited as further proof, further evidence against her that she was a subversive trying to lure American women into, dupe them into becoming communist sympathizers. The fourth major debate or claim that the book makes is that many more high-ranking government officials were defendants under the loyalty program than we have ever appreciated. The protracted investigations that many of them faced affected not just their individual careers. I mean, that was devastating enough. But it also, I argue, affected a wide range of social policies. And I try to document this with regard to a long list of examples: minimum wage, union rights, consumer protection laws, equal employment policy, public housing, public power, Native American affairs, and so on. Could go on. Government advocates of these policies, they supported these policies because they believed such policies would help reconcile what they saw as a tension between unregulated capitalism as an economic system and democracy as a political system. So they were trying to advocate these policies to make those things work together, capitalism and democracy. But in order to make the case, they had to criticize unregulated capitalism and talk about its undemocratic tendencies, and that got them in a lot of trouble. They were charged as being subversives, and they were either marginalized and pushed out of government, or to survive in government, they were pressured to adopt more centrist approaches. So this is probably the most ambitious claim of the book, and not everyone has agreed with me on it, but I would say that although there are many reasons for the United States' relatively stingy and incomplete safety net, welfare state, this was a really important one. This was one of those reasons. And the last major point of the book overall is that these policy effects of the loyalty program have been hidden from us, not only because of the records, the government documentation has been closed, but also the loyalty defendants themselves, for the most part, remained silent. Some even withheld materials from the archives or destroyed materials. In oral history, interviews, and memoirs, most loyalty defendants avoided discussing the accusations against them and also the activities that triggered those investigations. So the last observation or claim that I make is that the loyalty program really distorted the sources that scholars have relied on to write 20th century political history. Well, let me try to illustrate all those sort of abstract points with some actual human beings. In a classic portrayal of the New Deal, the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. explained that the Great Depression, by reducing private employment options, quote, made men of intellectual ability available as never before, and the government had never been so eager to hire them. Washington was deluged with an endless stream of bright young men. So he described how they worked long hours and debated politics and policies deep into the night, transforming stuffy, sleepy old Washington into a lively, sophisticated city. Quote, the memories would not soon fade, the interminable meetings, the litter of cigarette stubs, the call from the White House, the postponed dinner, the neglected wife, the office lights burning into the night, the lilacs hanging in fragrance above Georgetown gardens while men rebuilt the nation. A later generation of historians complicated Schlesinger's evocative portrait by identifying an influential network of female New Dealers, most of them born before 1890. Clustered in the female enclaves of the U.S. Women's Bureau and the U.S. Children's Bureau, both within the Department of Labor, and also clustered in the Women's Division of the Democratic Party, where they cooperated closely with Eleanor Roosevelt. These middle-aged liberal women wielded significant influence over certain social welfare and labor policies. Frances Perkins was one of the best known of these, but there were many others. So historians have celebrated those women's achievements while also noticing that sometimes their class and race perspectives limited their reform vision. I'm interested in some people who are missing from both these portraits, both Schlesinger's portrait and feminist scholars' pictures of New Deal liberal women. So I found this cohort of leftist women and men whose presence was crucial to the design and implementation of many hallmark New Deal policies. We know that capitalism's crisis shifted the American political spectrum leftward in the 1930s. We also know that the decade's protest movements included a radical student movement on college campuses. Less recognized is that after graduation, many of those young radicals, especially economists, lawyers, and social workers, and statisticians, maybe I should add, got jobs with the federal government. Government jobs were particularly attractive to a growing pool of white women professionals. My group includes only a few African American civil servants. African Americans had even more difficulty than white women in obtaining positions in government commensurate with their qualifications. Although they came from all over the country, the young radicals who found their way into New Deal jobs tended to share certain background experiences. Their parents often had been active in progressive movements of the 1910s on questions related to labor, racial justice, and women's suffrage. The young radicals often had been academic stars at top colleges and universities. Above all, what they had in common was coming of age in the early years of the Great Depression, which discredited various orthodoxies, particularly laissez-faire economics. In the student movement that emerged in 1932 in New York, but actually all over the country, they sought new answers to old problems that included not just labor exploitation and poverty, but also white supremacy and women's subordination. So the book is basically a collective biography of about 45 or 50 people, many of whom were in couples. They ascended rapidly in the Roosevelt administration and later were subjected to protracted loyalty investigations. So here's just a taste of some of those stories. Elizabeth Wickenden and Tex Goldschmidt's daughter gave me this photo. I guess Elizabeth had kept it on her desk. This was her favorite photo of them. Here they are on their honeymoon, just as they were starting to work for Harry Hopkins at the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Both initially focused on first relief and then public works, meaning government-created jobs programs. But then she became a major influence on social welfare policy, public assistance, while he moved into public power under Harold Ickes, and then later he was an official for the United Nations. They were founders of the Georgetown Day School. They sent their children there. It was the first interracial private school in Washington, and this was one of the many associations that anti-communist investigators held against them, because being against racial segregation raised a red flag to some viewers. They supported anti-fascist causes. Goldschmidt was an officer in the United Federal Workers. He organized his Federal Workers School. Their early private letters show that they both were committed feminists. I mean, her use of her given name is just a very small example of their commitment to women's rights. This is Lucy Kramer. She is, where's my arrow? That's her. She's an anthropologist there wearing indigenous dress with the Sioux. And her husband, the New Deal lawyer Felix Cohen, the two of them together led the Washington, D.C. Socialist Party in the 30s and 40s. They named their first daughter Jean after the radical anthropologist Jean Weltfish, who later headed the communist-influenced Congress of American Women. Assisted by Lucy Kramer's research, Felix Cohen drafted the legislation known as the Indian New Deal, which reversed several decades of federal policy intended to force Native Americans to abandon their tribal lands and cultures. This is Charlotte Tuttle. Her father was a prominent New York Republican who ran against Roosevelt for governor. I don't know if it was in 28 or 30. But Tuttle became a socialist while working undercover in a factory in 1929. She remained a socialist while earning top honors at Columbia Law School. I think she went to Vassar. Yes. I mentioned that since we're in Poughkeepsie. Those Vassar girls, always causing trouble. Felix Cohen hired her at the Department of the Interior. Did I say she got a law degree at Columbia Law, which she was one of the first women to do that and faced all kinds of harassment from her male co-students and from some professors. So Cohen hired her at the Department of the Interior. She traveled alone to Indian reservations to explain the new federal Indian policy. After a divorce, again, fairly avant-garde, she married David Demrest Lloyd, who was a lawyer for the La Follette Civil Liberties Committee. She met him at a hearing on the exploitation of migrant agricultural workers. These were very dedicated, intensely political people, so when she was on a vacation, she went to a hearing on migrant labor and met her second husband. She left government when David Lloyd, became an aide to President Truman. In the 1960s, she returned to the civil service, as Assistant General Counsel for the Treasury Department. I found this clipping in a folder right up the street. I just love can you see the captions there, the subheadings in the wedding ban fight, ousted teacher to sue, charges Hitler acts, irate woman. I like the irate woman. Ware was an economic historian who organized a national media protest after the University of Wyoming canceled her teaching contract because they found out that she was married to someone who worked for the federal government. Or I think actually it was just because she was married, period. Ware's husband was the New Deal economist Gardner Means. Investigators later became suspicious of Ware because in addition to supporting many progressive causes, she used her maiden name and was known to defy conventions. I found a little notation on her FBI file in handwriting that says, known to defy convention, recommend further investigation. And she was a professor at Vassar, and her students included there Elizabeth Wickenden and Charlotte Tuttle. It's a conspiracy. The League of Women Shoppers. It's an interesting women's group. There they are picketing on roller skates. They agitated for labor rights, wartime price controls, and fair employment practices. Fair employment practices was a reference to racial discrimination. They were concerned about race and sex discrimination in workplaces. A staff member of the House Un-American Activities Committee named J.B. Matthews held a personal grudge against the League of Women Shoppers, and he labeled it a Trojan horse for communists. Many female New Dealers and wives of male New Dealers belonged to the League's Washington branch, and many of them faced loyalty charges as a result. Eleanor Roosevelt belonged to the Washington League of Women Shoppers. She actually defended the group from Matthews' charges in 1939. League officer Lucille Ezekiel, does anybody really know their New Dealers? Can you guess who her husband was? Brain truster Mordecai Ezekiel. His papers are at the FDR library up the street. He was an economist in the Department of Agriculture, and later he was at the UN. So I'm still just introducing a bunch of characters here. Catherine Bauer was labeled sort of the quintessential new woman of the 1920s. She was a feminist, she smoked, she drank. She had affairs with men in several countries, including a married man. She became an international star with the 1934 publication of a book called Modern Housing. She and Leon Kaiserling were lovers in the 1930s and exchanged hundreds of letters discussing the romantic subject of housing policy. I found those letters in her papers out at Berkeley. Leon, as a legislative aide to Senator Robert Wagner of New York, drafted some of the most progressive New Deal policies, including the National Labor Relations Act and public housing legislation. Bauer and Kaiserling remained political allies long after they ended their romance and married other people, and both of them later edged away from the left after facing loyalty charges. Others had noticed some edging away from the left, but they hadn't known about the loyalty investigations. So those are some of the people that the book discusses. And I just think it's interesting to step back and think about how meeting some of these folks changes our image of the New Deal, and also might help explain the reaction against the New Deal. There was kind of a sexually modernist, left liberal scene of young people in Washington. And some of them, I mean, they were really hard workers, they were very smart. Some of them obtained positions of some authority, sort of as number 2 or number 3 in command at various agencies. And so that really qualifies the image of the New Deal as a world, to use historian Alan Brinkley's words. Alan Brinkley described the New Deal as a world overwhelmingly dominated by middle-class white men, most of whom were insulated by position or temperament or both from the pressures and claims of popular politics and social movements. So some of our prior images of the New Deal is this very sort of isolated intellectual circle of policy wonks unconnected to the big social movements of the 30s, and I really don't think that that's correct, or not completely true. So to the contrary, many of the women and men who became New Dealers brought the ideas and spirit of Popular Front social movements with them. Now, most Roosevelt administration policies did not turn out to be as leftist or as feminist or as anti-racist as they would have liked. But the influence of these young people in some New Deal agencies nonetheless confirmed the right's stereotypes and fears and stimulated a powerful reaction. And you may boo if you like. That was kind of unfair. I chose the most unflattering picture. It wasn't actually that hard to find an unflattering picture of Martin Dies. But something about the feet on the desk, that camera angle there is very harsh. Dies was a leading opponent of the National Labor Relations Act before he became the first chair of the Special Committee to investigate un-American activities. So the Dies Committee is the forerunner to HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee. President Roosevelt's attitude toward Martin Dies was that Dies was a fanatic and best ignored. That's what Roosevelt actually said. There was another House committee that was also trying to convince the public that the Labor Relations Board and the Office of Price Administration were controlled by communists, and that was the Smith Committee, headed by Howard Smith of Virginia. I was going to go on to explain. Now that I started, I have to explain it. It's worth mentioning that the Smith Committee's general counsel had represented the steel industry in its unsuccessful effort to have the Wagner Act struck down as unconstitutional. So I think that's an interesting connection. So here is J.B. Matthews, who called himself an ex-fellow traveler. He soon after this hearing joined the Dies Committee staff and began keeping files on left-leaning New Dealers. The ex-communist Ben Mandel joined the Dies Committee too, and the two of them served for decades on a succession of congressional investigating committees. HUAC, made permanent after the war, Senator McCarthy's subcommittee, Senator Pat McCarran's Senate committee, which was called SIS, the Senate Internal Security Committee. This group of congressional staffers cooperated with conservative newspaper columnists such as Fulton Lewis, Walter Trohan, George Sokolsky, and Westbrook Pegler, and they also corresponded to some extent with the FBI, none of which was legal, right? But I found this in FBI files and in the private papers of these different journalists. 2 chapters of the book are an extended case study of the cases of Mary Dublin and Leon Kaiserling, who married in 1940. She attracted the attention of Dies Committee staffers back when she was an activist for labor and consumer rights in the 30s. When she entered government service in 1940 as a consultant to the Office of Price Administration, they took notice. Not until later did they realize that they had really struck gold, because she was married to Leon Kaiserling, the drafter of the Wagner Act, and also her brother-in-law, George Marshall, not the General George Marshall, a different George Marshall, was a wealthy funder of communist causes. A gifted statistician and economist, Mary Dublin worked at a succession of agencies. She worked at the Office of Civilian Defense for Eleanor Roosevelt. And then after the war, she established herself as a division head in the Office of International Trade in the Department of Commerce. And here's Leon later in his career than when you last saw him. He drafted the full employment legislation that led to the creation of the CEA and became its chair in 1950. You don't have to read all this. I know that's an unfriendly slide, and there will not be a test. But this was the chronology of the Kaiserling's loyalty case, which was actually typical of many cases. The main point is that these things came in waves. The loyalty standards were tightened several times, so people were reinvestigated. Even with no new charges and no new evidence, cases were reopened because the bar for loyalty had moved. The FBI kept tabs on the Kaiserlings into the 1970s, and people knew when the FBI was investigating them. The FBI would go and talk to your neighbors and your college professors and your coworkers, and it usually got back to you. So my point in mentioning that is how long-lasting the repressive effects of the loyalty program were. I mean, even though the loyalty program really, as this slide shows, its heyday ended in the 50s. But the people who had been through those investigations and who were still, their file was kept updated by the FBI, they were scarred for life. So there are lots and lots more details about the Kaiserling case. And it's quite involved. It involves, accusations that she had switched identity with her sister, and did they dye their hair or not? And there were endless. This is their Barnard. The FBI got their Barnard College yearbook photos and all their passport photos, and all the big ex-communist witnesses, including Paul Crouch, came out to try to say that Mary had been a Communist Party member. Although Paul Crouch had told his tales about the Kaiserlings to Senator McCarthy back in 1951, McCarthy waited until February 1952, he waited for the second anniversary of his Wheeling, West Virginia, Lincoln's Day talk. He waited to attack them, and there's a lot of evidence of the partisan motives in these cases, because attacks were off, the timing of which allegations were made was usually related to something that was going on in political elections or somebody's own career. This unpleasant headline appeared in October 1952, just weeks before the election. turns out, I found that the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, I can't say it, CIS's staff leaked the supposedly confidential loyalty investigation material to the press. And so the Kaiserlings were actually correct to suspect a plot against them. Not only were all kinds of things shared amongst agencies and the FBI and the press, but also the FBI told the Civil Service Commission loyalty boards that Paul Crouch was reliable, when internal FBI correspondence shows that they knew that, they didn't believe what Paul Crouch was saying about Mary Dublin Kaiserling, but Paul Crouch was their key witness in a case against Robert Oppenheimer that was going on right then, the nuclear physicist, the Manhattan Project guy, and so they didn't want to jeopardize Crouch's credibility, so the Kaiserlings sort of took the hit for that. So it's quite clear to me that the counter-subversives were dishonest and unfair in their pursuit of the Kaiserlings. But it also turns out that the Kaiserlings were not entirely truthful as they tried to defend themselves. Knowing that the security apparatus was rigged against them and not trusting loyalty officials to distinguish between communists and spies and other leftists, defendants typically downplayed any evidence of progressive views and sometimes even tried to portray themselves as conservative, which was quite comical, actually, to see Leon Kaiserling trying to convince the CIS committee that he was conservative when he had drafted all this liberal legislation. Mary Dublin Kaiserling's appointment books were found in a metal box by her bed in the late 1990s, actually by the history professor that Laura Murphy mentioned at the beginning, by Tom Dublin. That's a complicated connection, but it's kind of a small world. They found these appointment books, didn't realize that she had deliberately withheld them from the archives and sent them to the Schlesinger Library. Along with letters to her parents that she thought had been destroyed, these materials demonstrate that Mary Dublin Kaiserling was much further to the left than she later maintained to investigators, and then years later to scholars and interviewers. She was a committed socialist. She was active in many popular front groups. She led student tours to the Soviet Union and so forth. Now, there was nothing wrong with any of those things, but under the pressure of investigation, she felt compelled to hide them. So there are a lot of different things on this page. It's kind of, moves from the mundane to the, so she's got her dentist appointment here, but she's also meeting with Kenneth Durant, some kind of correspondent for Soviet TASS, Mary Van Cleek. For lunch, Mary Van Cleek was probably a party member, and this became a big point in her hearings, was how many times had she had lunch in the 1930s with Mary Van Cleek. And she said none, but her appointment books show that they had lunch. Oh, I did check the Communist Party papers, just to see if she was a communist spy, but she wasn't. I also talked to some Communist Party members who told me she wasn't. And similarly, I found letters from Leon to his father back in the early New Deal years, where he was clearly, was trying to decide whether to vote for socialist Norman Thomas or the communist William Z. Foster. I think he was just trying to give his dad a heart attack and not really serious. I mean, he was only about 22 years old. But these are the kinds of things that would have been very damning years later, and he always made himself out to be a centrist liberal. Loyalty defendants went to great lengths to keep their investigations secret, and I include this. So these appointment books, you can see where it's marked XXX here. Had I not been simultaneously reading the transcripts from the Civil Service Commission file that I had declassified from the National Archives in Maryland, I would never have known what the XXX meant. But even in her own personal appointment books that ended up under her bed, she didn't write down, "This is the day of my first hearing before the Senate committee." And her brother, who I interviewed, didn't know that she had this case. He knew that she had been accused because some of it got into the news, but he had no idea what was going on behind the scenes. Scholars hitherto have been unaware of Leon Kaiserling's loyalty case, and the few to note that McCarthy accused Mary Dublin, Kaiserling, interpret her recovery and appointment in the 1960s as head of the U.S. Women's Bureau as a triumph over the injustices of the Second Red Scare. So one message would be, oh, well, there were some excesses, but it got straightened out, in the end. But that is too simple a moral. The Kaiserlings' triumph and comeback came at great cost to the causes they had once espoused. Under the pressure of investigation, the Kaiserlings adopted anti-communist rhetoric, edged away from anything associated with the left. They shifted from working for policies for economic redistribution and instead started promoting economic growth. They both avidly supported President Johnson's policy in Vietnam. They became regular party workers for the Democratic Party, where before they had been critical of the two-party system, and they eluded socialism entirely from their political autobiographies. Now, it's possible that this would have happened anyway. They just grew out of their socialism. They just got older and more mature. But the timing and all-consuming nature of the loyalty investigations makes it hard to dismiss their impact entirely. The fact that we're left guessing about why these people, and they're an example of, they stand in for many other people, why we're left guessing about their rightward shift, or shift toward the center, I should say, that is certainly attributable to the loyalty program because it led the Kaiserlings to obscure their intellectual evolution and misrepresent themselves. So their case is just all the other people I introduced went through analogous traumas. Some of these, Eleanor Roosevelt was very good friends with Esther Peterson. Her husband was a labor attaché in the State Department. He was one of McCarthy's 52 names. And Esther Peterson believed that his loyalty case killed him. And when she was in power, in the 60s under Kennedy and then Johnson, she was constantly under surveillance and constantly nagged by the worry that the charges of subversion, because she had been a labor activist and her work was held against her husband, she was worried that that was going to rear its head. And so it really chilled her militance in the kinds of policies she was willing to defend in the 60s. And there are a lot of these stories. Wilbur Cohen similarly shifted in his views on social insurance and public assistance after being the subject of an intensive investigation directed largely at his wife's activities. This is something actually his biographer, Ed Berkowitz, wasn't even aware of, that there had been this loyalty investigation, but his son found the papers in his attic. And then that sent me off after some other leads. There, Tex and Wiki again, looking quite a bit older than they did on their honeymoon at Lake George. Happens to the best of us. They were really admirable people, but they were deeply opposed to Johnson's policy in Vietnam. They were old friends with Johnson, but their leverage was really reduced. Tex had been attacked as a pink in 1948 and had been moved out of the U.S. government, gone over to the UN, and felt that that he would just hurt Lyndon Johnson if he was too vocal. So I'm going on, I think, a little bit too long, but the point is that there are a lot of these stories. Each one is poignant, detailed, complicated, but what I've tried to do in this book is to show or just hint at how the accumulation of these traumas hurt not only these individuals, but also created a chilling effect on discussion of policy alternatives and ways of reconciling a capitalist economic system with a political democracy. And I think we're still feeling some of the costs of that lack of open debate now in politics today. So I could talk more about that if you'd like me to in question and answers, but for now I think I've gone on quite long enough, and so I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Storrs, for that wonderful lecture. And we're open for questions and answers, as Professor Storrs says. Anyone want to start out? Yes. Oh, right.
Soul. Go ahead.
I always feel like Phil Donahue doing this.
So I have two questions. One is just very simple in terms of just picturing what kind of questions the FBI would ask neighbors. I just got a call yesterday from the FBI, literally about a student that they're just checking. So I'm like, oh wow, is this because this is still going on? And it was in a one credit course. I had the student for 15 weeks, 1 hour a week. I couldn't say anything, so I didn't have any conversation. But I'm curious what it would have gone to then. And the other thing is what you think I would like to hear what you think the effect is today.
Well, I'm not sure. I would imagine it might have been an immigration issue or maybe a student loan fraud issue. I don't really know why. Oh, well, then they wanted to hire the former student. They just wanted to know. But I don't think you can say too much because of FERPA, right? But you could give a reference. I don't know what that would have been. I mean, this program, the Supreme Court reigned in the loyalty program in the late 50s with a series of decisions. I should say it wasn't Supreme Court rise to the rescue. I mean, in the early 50s, the Supreme Court supported the loyalty program and was part of the problem. But as the political climate shifted, and as other things, McCarthy fell from grace in 54, Harvey Matisow recanted, admitted he had lied and said that a bunch of the others were lying. Quite a few things happened, but for various reasons, the FBI was told to cut it out. Now, unfortunately, we now know that J. Edgar Hoover, who was around from like 1921 until the early 70s, heading the FBI, what he did was just do illegal surveillance of the protest movements of the 60s. There was no loyalty program anymore, but he did have, as we know, Martin Luther King and some of the women's groups and the Black Panthers, all those groups. So under a program called, I don't know if you say COINTELPRO or COINTELPRO, maybe some of you know, the FBI was still putting activists, and especially young sort of protesters, under surveillance, well, particularly in the anti-war movement, Wounded Knee, the airlift in 1973. So now what would they have been asking the neighbors? They would have been, you would see reading the FBI files is like reading a bunch of staticky trash. I mean, it's so garbled. It's such a telephone game. And the agents, were trained to just put down everything they heard. So there was all kinds of gossip and contradictory stuff, and names were mixed up. All kinds of things were wrong. But neighbors did sometimes say things like they had seen, communist stuff in the mail was the most common issue. But also a lot of coming and going, unusual groups of people, records, Russian records. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. And those kinds of things did come out pretty quickly in the papers in the 50s as sort of the height of the absurdity. Oh, just because I have marks on my bookshelf doesn't make me a communist. So that kind of gossip was the kind of thing they picked up. The more damning stuff didn't come out that way. But I mean, for example, I remember Leon Kaiser, somebody reported to the FBI that they heard him say at a dinner party in 1946 that Truman was full of baloney to be so worried about the communists and was just trying to scare Americans into paying more taxes, because, or something like that. So there was, so first of all, okay, so what if he said that? But secondly, somebody years later is reporting this as evidence of subversive tendencies. So, the FBI cast a very wide net. They would ask professors if they noticed any leftist inclinations. They looked for both ideological stuff, but also for associations with certain groups or certain causes. So it was just like a big trash dump of, oh, she had a black friend. I mean, that was one thing held against Caroline Ware, was that she had African American students come and stay at her house. And that was considered a sign that she was probably a communist. So, now, well, it would be, I don't want to oversimplify or be too linear, but you can see how, the idea that Obamacare is, or I should say the Affordable Care Act is socialistic. Did anybody see the Socialist Party, which apparently still exists somewhere, wrote to the Washington Post and said, please don't embarrass us by saying that the Affordable Care Act is socialist, because we would have come up with something much better and cleaner and simpler than this. But anyway, I think they're referring to all the prerogatives of the insurance companies and the doctors. But anyway, the fact that calling something socialistic is still sort of a club used to stymie. I mean, it's even moved to the right of where it was, because Eisenhower was never leading the right-wing anti-communist charge, but he certainly, it worked for him. It served his political purposes. He didn't rein in McCarthy right away. But he believed in minimum wages, and he believed in Social Security. And so now it's shifted more to the right, where that sort of any time you think the government should do something or have any, raise the minimum wages, then that's communist, because you're taking from the makers and giving to the takers or something, So I think the I could be more, that's a very sort of half-assed, pardon my language, presentist sort of comment. I could try to be more rigorous as a historian and say that I think it really hurt the country, in my view, that the fair deal that Truman tried to pass to complete some of the programs, the New Deal had a lot of big holes in the safety net, like, old age insurance and unemployment insurance don't really work. I mean, there was supposed to be a third leg of the stool called health insurance, and FDR tried to get it passed, Truman tried to get it passed, and instead we got this sort of Medicare and Medicaid in the 60s. Public works programs to deal with the fact that there's always a certain level of unemployment, but to have some sort of decent ongoing public works programs. If you had filled that out and really had full employment and a comprehensive more comprehensive safety net. That wouldn't mean ending capitalism and going to socialism, but it might have mitigated some of the inequality. Of course, the major problem also with the New Deal was that so much of its legislation excluded people of color, in deference largely to Southern Democrats. Agricultural and domestic workers were excluded, and so Truman would have liked to fill some of those things in, but by sort of stunting the New Deal, where nothing new got passed really after 38. If anything, it was moving backwards. Taft-Hartley in 47 took back some of the Wagner Act. So I think this red baiting that suffocated Truman's program in the 40s, continued to chill bait in the 50s, and even Lyndon Johnson, was so worried about, what he saw Truman's fate. He didn't want to be soft on communism. So, and a lot of his people were scarred survivors of those earlier battles. And so they said, look, let's not talk about re-slicing the pie. Let's just grow the pie. And that way we don't have to take anything away and be called communists. You see what I mean? So I think you can establish some continuity from the 30s down to the present. But you can also make, as I was doing at first, kind of more superficial analogies just between the current use of socialism as a sort of a, what's the word I mean, but as a name calling to make the public nervous that if they support higher minimum wage law that there's maybe Stalinists or something, That was a long answer. Nobody's going to want to ask another question now.
It's a great answer.
We have till midnight, right?
Claudia?
I was wondering if any of those New Dealers served in the military during World War II, and if so, did that mitigate the disloyalty charges against them?
That is a great question. And I'm just running through my sort of file of note cards in my head and thinking about their different. A lot of them served in the war effort. A lot of them served various missions in London, and so I don't know if some of them were too high-ranking to go. They certainly weren't in, but Bill de Blasio's, Mayor de Blasio's father, Warren Wilhelm, lost, maybe somebody else will remember the details, I think he lost one of his legs from the knee down, maybe at Okinawa in the Pacific, and came back and continued doing whatever he was still a pretty young man. I can't remember what he was doing in the Commerce Department, something not high ranking, some middle bureaucrat type of job. And his wife, Maria de Blasio, had worked translating Italian in the Office of War Information, and they got slammed. He sat in hearing after hearing, missing a leg from serving in the war, and was really bitter that he was being found disloyal and being threatened with the loss of his job. Mind you, not only did you lose your job, but then if you lost your government job, oh, well, government job's not a right. Well, if it got around, and it did, if you were far enough along, people would say, well, where did you work before? Nobody in the private sector would hire you. And so it could mean unemployment for a long time. He did end up jumping over to the private sector, but as you may know from reading some of the New York Times coverage last year that I had some part in bringing to light, the father ended up becoming very depressed and alcoholic and killed himself. I don't want to lay all of that right at the doorstep of the loyalty program. I mean, losing your leg in the war would be pretty depressing too. But and people become alcoholics and kill themselves for other reasons. But it couldn't have helped, could it? To be in these hearings that went on and on that you had to hide from your kids. Mayor de Blasio never knew about it till this story, till this complicated story, how it came out, but it was because I stumbled on the file. So military service was not a free pass. And the accusations against him were that one of his college roommates remembered that he had gone to Communist Party meetings at Yale. I mean, in the 30s. So it's not like he was being put through the mill because of some really stuff where you could see why they'd be suspicious. It was the usual mélange of associations. Somebody said that his wife's translations into Italian seemed too sympathetic to the Russian side during the war. So, that is a good question, because a lot, all the discussion of patriotism and service after the war and the GI Bill, and so I should look into that. I'd be interested to know more. Thank you.
Other questions?
I like that early quote by Arthur Schlesinger. He was clearly taken in with those people when he was a young man. He probably tried to relive this in the Kennedy White House, right? And that didn't quite work out. So my question is that, so you talked about the 1930s as this young idealistic left being in government, whereas in the second great wave of liberalism during the Great Society, the idealistic left was outside government. Is there any, can you sort of comment on, because there was probably no equivalent, right, in the Great Society to these, Great Society government, like in the Lyndon Johnson administration, equivalent to these people, right, in the Roosevelt administration?
I think you're absolutely right, and that's another thing that could go down in the casualty column is the severing of transmission between generations of the left. And so because, say, to take Mary and Leon Kaiserling again, because they shifted to the right, went to growth economics and Cold War liberalism, save the free world from communism, fight in Vietnam, they were completely discredited amongst the next generation of leftists to come up. And so they viewed, as I'm sure many of you know, if you study, young radicals in the 60s hated the liberals more than they hated the conservatives. And they viewed Johnson and the Kaiserlings as part of the liberal establishment, and they were completely hostile to any kind of government sort of work within the system. I may be overstating it slightly. And also, within the War on Poverty programs, there were some more grassroots projects, community action program that did use government funds to create some, but Johnson didn't stand by that too long. I mean, when the what began hitting the fan over the Head Start program in Mississippi and so forth. But yeah, your point about the generational estrangement between 60s liberals and 60s leftists, I think, is because some of those 60s liberals had been further to the left earlier, and they thought that these young people just didn't know what they were getting into and would regret it someday, or that, or they couldn't acknowledge their sympathy to their views. I mean, I'm being pretty sweeping here, but as a broad pattern. Yes, Mr. Handel.
From the 40s to the 60s, in addition to the DICE committee, there were local committees and local levels who were very anti-intellectual. They went after all the faculty of all the colleges, and that created a whole generation of people who were afraid to admit they were liberals. What effect did that have, you think, on the decline of the forward liberalism movement of the New Deal and even in the Johnson administration?
Yes, I think it had a huge effect, and it is very important to note. The federal employee loyalty program is just one little slice, and I think it was an important slice, and it was one that was waiting to be written about because the records had been closed. So that's where I was able to make a new intervention, but it's a tiny slice of the whole Red Scare phenomenon and the chilling of open debate and discussion. And you're absolutely right. I could recommend First of all, Ellen Schrecker has a 1986 book that still holds up. It's very detailed, but if you're interested in academia and political repression, it's called No Ivory Tower. If you want a great overview of the whole phenomenon, her second book is called Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America. And so she has chapters where she sort of sums up, okay, well, let's look at Hollywood and the arts, let's look at intellectual, academia, let's look at unions. So that's a great overview. I would also point out that a new area of research is to look more at the local level, because most cities had their red squads, most state legislatures had their, or not, maybe not most, but many. I know there was the Tenney Committee in California. Michael Heel, who's he's English, and I think he's just retired, but he's written a wonderful book called McCarthy's Americans, in which he is the best refutation of the whole, yeah, but there were spies, it's not like it was a witch hunt, because there weren't any witches, but there were spies. And you say, yes, of course, I know there are spies. But he was able to point out that if you look at this pattern on a map of Red Scares and the timing of them around the country, they flare up at different moments and around different issues, and those issues have nothing to do with the strength of the Red Menace in those areas. It has to do with a changing in the guard of the local political establishment, or a Catholic-Protestant conflict in Boston, or a white supremacy battle, in Atlanta. So looking at the local and regional level at how anti-communism played out is really interesting for looking at the complicated sort of sociological, or I guess just political dynamics at work. But they also sure bring home the scale of how this thing it was really hard to avoid. And a whole generation, I can't tell you how many people, I was giving a talk at the AHA in New York in January, and I felt like I was kind of the odd person out, because the other people were talking about the Great Purge under Stalin and the massacre of hundreds of thousands of Indonesians, and I felt like McCarthyism was kind of lightweight compared to, these slaughters of millions. But one of the scholars of the Russian problem turned to me and said, my father couldn't get a job in a university or anywhere else, and he told me when I went to college, whatever you do, don't join any groups. I don't care what they call themselves, don't join any groups and don't sign any petitions. And you hear that over and over again. So it crushed civic participation because people were so worried. Thank you for that question. You are a really tenacious crowd. I'm impressed. I'm fine. I could go all night, but I worry about some of, but this is a good group.
Last question. Oh, no. Now I have to make it better than I think it is. Red Scare being communist, heaven forbid, and reading the last 10 years of wonderful fun. Can you put a gross time frame on when socialism was blurred into communism and somebody forgot how to read the definitions? And therefore, the moment you were not laissez-faire capitalist, you had to be with all of that.
Yeah.
And it seems
I can.
It seems that it's blurred on purpose. Obviously, it's a group slander. No parsing necessary.
I think, yeah, that's actually a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a great answer to it, but I think that is really the essence of it in some ways. Some people would say, well, it's the Communist Party's fault because the Popular Front of the 1935 to 39 period was a strategy advocated by the communists to make, to make common cause with liberals and anybody else who wanted to fight fascism. So the Popular or United Front Against Fascism became a coalition. And there was lots of discussion in that period, you know, I mean, there were anti-communist socialists, as you may know, going, you know, way back, but certainly raging in the garment unions in New York in the 20s. There are all kinds of factions, and so everybody said, let's put that aside right now and cooperate against Hitler if we're all agreed that we want, you know, better things for working people. Now we'll put aside our doctrinaire differences and so on and so on. So some of the blurring, I guess, you know, was initiated by the left, and then that gave, I would say, opportunistic rather than ideological conservatives an opportunity to lump them all together. But to be more specific, during World War II, the Civil Service Commission forbade, after controversy on this point, forbade its examiners from asking people whether they were members of the Socialist Party. And they had to write out a list of things that could not be held against government employees, because there was nothing, you know, so in 1939, the Hatch Act said no government employee can do political lobbying. That was something about the WPA. But it also said no government employee can belong to an organization that advocates the overthrow of the government. And so that's what made it illegal or that's what made it impossible to be a Communist Party member, according to that, you know, to one reading of the Hatch Act. But all throughout World War II, the Civil Service Commission said you can't hold it against a government employee that they were a Socialist Party member. And I have people being interviewed. Paul Porter, who became an administrator of the Marshall Plan in 1952 or 51, he's over in Europe. He gets recalled because Homer Ferguson finds out that in 1943 he said to the FBI, well, I'm a small s socialist. You know, he didn't feel defensive about that at all in 1943. So I think that when I don't know exactly when, but you know, then the Dies Committee attacked the Civil Service Commission for its lax standards and subpoenaed a bunch of their files in 45, and they just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it. And, you know, Roosevelt thought it was ridiculous, but when, unfortunately, you know, when Stalin started doing his business and world events played into the hands of people who wanted to, you know, and there were some spies who did help get the Soviets get the bomb more quickly and so forth. So I guess I would say 1947.
Thank you so much, Landon, Storrs. Fascinating. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And just a reminder that Professor Storrs will be signing the second Red Scare out in the lobby if you'd like to get a copy. Thank you for coming. Good night.
Thank you all. Great questions. Thank you for your great questions. I really enjoyed myself.